8 men go missing from the church and the Wellesley Village in Canada, a place known for its happy and celebratory vibe, a place where anyone from any community can meet each other and support each other. No evidence, no arrest, and no bodies for a whole decade. Who did it and why? Welcome back to Twisted Minds. My name is James, and in this true crime documentary today, we will explore the case of Bruce McArthur, who mercilessly killed not one, but more than half a dozen innocent people in Canada. It is said that most serial killers usually start their rampage when they're in their 20s. That wasn't the case with Bruce McArthur, who started living out his disturbing fantasies in his 50s. What happened that triggered Bruce McArthur? What made him take a sharp, dark turn after living a regular life for so long? From a normal family life to an unbelievably twisted mind, let's find out what really happened. Born on October 8th, 1951 in Ontario, McArthur grew up in Woodville, near Toronto. He came from a religious household and was allegedly bullied by his father. Bruce was raised on a farm in Argyle, near Woodville, in the Kawartha Lake region. McArthur has a sister, and his parents also fostered troubled children from Toronto, often with up to 6 or 10 in their care at any time. McArthur's mother was Irish Catholic, and his father was a Scottish Presbyterian. Their different faiths caused multiple arguments, and McArthur would always support his mother. This led to his father's bullying. Bruce attended the Fenelon Falls Secondary School. He was in the closet about being gay, and back in the 60s, it was taboo to have any other sexuality than heterosexuality, so he faked being straight for almost his entire adulthood. His fake sexual identity didn't stop at a young age. He ended up marrying his supposed college sweetheart, Janice Campbell, at the age of 23. Bruce McArthur soon lost both of his parents. His mother died of cancer in 1978, and his father too succumbed to an illness in 1981. Bruce and his wife moved to Oshawa in 1979, and they even had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. He was married to Janice for 25 long years before the marriage broke down. All through his marriage, McArthur maintained a socially acceptable image that wasn't frowned upon at the time. He wanted to be that perfect family man, and a religious one at that. He was devoted to the church at the time, and the reason for that may have been to curb his urges to explore his homosexuality. He thought that going to church would probably change who he was. He simply didn't want to accept that he was gay. He didn't want that reality to set in. McArthur worked as a salesman, and it wasn't until the 1990s that he came out as gay to his wife Janice. You might think that Janice would simply pack her bags and disappear with the kids, but that wasn't the case. She decided to stay with Bruce for the kids. However, things took a gloomy turn when their finances plummeted and they filed for bankruptcy shortly before finally getting divorced in 1997. A 46-year-old Bruce McArthur moved back to Toronto as there was no gay community in Oshawa. He could finally be himself, and he also started visiting gay neighborhoods regularly. He eventually found a partner too, but once he and his partner broke up, Bruce went to therapy and was put on antidepressants. Soon after, he started a landscaping company called Artistic Design. Sounds like a nice story, right? About a person who couldn't really be himself, but was eventually able to be who he really was. Despite the heartbreak, he moved on and started his own company. Sounds too good to be true. Yes, it is. Because just when things seemed to be getting better, Bruce McArthur would take a dark turn. Bruce was part of the community in the main LGBTQ+ neighborhood. A lot of men soon began to go missing from the Church and Wellesley area, of which Bruce was a part of. The Church and Wellesley community was popular among the LGBTQ+ community. People often socialized here and found new friends and a support system. The place was known to be a safe neighborhood. So what happened that shocked the community? Why did people from here go missing? The missing men in Canada. Salim Essen and Andrew Kingsman, 2017. Dean Lizowick, 2016. Suresh Mahmoodi, 2015. Majid Kaihan, 2012. Skanda Navaratnam, 2010. Abdul Bazir Faizi, 2010. What happened in the span of a decade that the police were unable to solve? It was a dark time for the gay community because men were going missing and the cops tried to decode what was going on, but always came to the same conclusion: no serial killer. That's what they thought, because according to them, the evidence did not really match the doings of a serial killer. But if that really was the case, why were only gay men being targeted? Bruce McArthur's name came up again and again, but there was no evidence. And the old man who came across as so gentle and polite right? Could he really be hiding a deep, dark secret for over a decade behind that facade? 2017, Andrew Kingsman goes missing. Kingsman's friends reported him missing after their emails went unanswered and he missed his routine appointments. His friends' text messages received a dreadful silence, and they immediately knew something was wrong. It was very unlike Andrew to not respond for days. He was last seen on June 26th, near his home in the northeast corner of Toronto Centre. The police reached a dead end. They found nothing. 2 years on, and there were more disappearances, which led the police to starting Project Houston, the aim of which was to solve the disappearances of many gay men throughout the several years previous. This led them to Skanda Navaratnam's disappearance 7 years ago. Skanda Navaratnam was a 40-year-old Sri Lankan refugee and was last seen on the early morning of September 6, 2010, leaving a bar at Church Street. He was with an unknown man. Despite trying to find him, there was no evidence. The police found nothing, and the case remained unsolved. December 2010, Abdul Basir Faizi went missing. A 42-year-old husband and father, Abdul went missing too. His family was clueless about his sexuality, as he had kept it a secret. They didn't know that he visited gay bars and was part of the gay community. He went missing only 3 months after Skanda's disappearance. That is, in December 2010. October 2012. 58-year-old Majid Kaihan went missing in October 2012. He too was leading a double life, as his family knew nothing about his sexuality. He had no shady business or dealings, and the police once again came to a dead end. They were puzzled as to how these men, with seemingly no troubled lives or any kind of problematic scenarios, just went missing out of the blue. Despite living dual lives, they didn't really have anything that pointed to any kind of trouble. They were all simple men with very simple family lives. And then there was a clue. The Swiss police got a bizarre call from an informant who told them that there exists an online cannibalism fetish community. This informant had been actively chatting with someone called John Jacob. This John Jacob had told the informant that he had murdered and eaten a brown male from Toronto's gay community. The informant thought that it wasn't true, but when he did his research, he was shocked to find that there were indeed missing men from the gay community in Toronto. So, who was John Jacob, and what did he have to do with the missing men? The police were still not able to put the pieces of the puzzle together. One thing they were now sure of was that this was not a missing persons case anymore. It was a murder, but without evidence. There was no way for the cops to do anything. By 2013, the police found out that John Jacob had nothing to do with the disappearances of the 3 men. Project Houston eventually failed. No evidence, no bodies, nothing. Sadly, the investigation was closed. 2015, Suresh Mahmoodi went missing, and the men start going missing yet again. Gay men from the same area of Church and Wellesley. Suresh Mahmoodi was a professional painter of Iranian descent, and, like Skanda, he too was a refugee. He went missing in August 2015 after last being seen near his home in Toronto. He hadn't returned home from work, so his wife had contacted the police to report him missing. They tried to find him, but once again, no trace of Mahmoodi, and the investigation went cold. 2017, Salim Essen went missing. 44-year-old Salim Essen was a citizen of Turkey and was last seen on April 15, 2017, near his home in Church and Wellesley. 7 long years, 5 innocent men missing, all from the gay community of Church and Wellesley, and almost all brown males. There had to be a connecting link to all of these missing men. There had to be one serial killer behind all of this, a cruel monster with a dark fantasy, and someone who is really good at covering their tracks.
He is keeping them after death. He was posing them in photographs.
It's easy to see that these men weren't just missing. They were probably dead, and the killer was someone who was purposefully targeting minorities, probably because they received less media attention compared to Caucasians. So, was this serial killer ever going to be found? Was he going to roam free to find his next victims? His days were numbered when Andrew Kingsman went missing. This time, the police weren't going to rest until they found the culprit. They weren't going to stop searching. They were determined to find the monster responsible for all of these men who went missing. and they found a clue. In the CCTV footage from Andrew Kingsman's neighborhood, a red car. It was a red Dodge Caravan that went around the block 2 times around the same time Andrew went missing, in the afternoon at about 2:30 p.m. At the time, there were around 6,000 red Dodge Caravans in Toronto. How are the police going to narrow down on the one person of interest or their suspect? They had to find another clue, and they did. Andrew Kingsman used to routinely use his calendar, and the police found out on that particular day he went missing, he was scheduled to meet a certain Bruce at 3 p.m. They matched the data of the owners of all of the red Dodge Caravans in Toronto and found that the Bruce Andrew was going to meet was Bruce McArthur. This name wasn't alien to the cop. Where had they heard it before? During Project Houston. Now they had a solid lead. If he was interrogated during Project Houston and he also was the owner of the red Dodge Caravan that circled the block twice when Andrew Kingsman went missing, there has to be a connection. The cops had finally found their person of interest in the cases of all those men missing. Here's a little flashback as to how they first met Bruce McArthur and why his name resurfacing mattered, now more than ever. During the investigation when Project Houston was ongoing, the cyber authorities had previously retrieved data from the gay websites that were used by all the missing men. There resurfaced a username, Silver Fox. And Silver Fox was none other than Bruce McArthur. And in 2013, Bruce McArthur was interviewed by the authorities. Not as a suspect, not as a person of interest, but as a mere witness, as there was absolutely no evidence or even a hint of his involvement in the missing men's cases. Now the authorities connected the dots and put the final pieces of their puzzle together. Bruce McArthur definitely was the person they had been looking for all along. Now they had to nab him and put him behind bars. But how to find evidence or get him to confess to what he did to all of those missing men? Bruce McArthur, a soft-spoken old man who was once a Santa Claus at a mall, was now a murder suspect. How did this man who seemingly had no criminal record go on a rampage? How could he suddenly take a cruel turn, right after his life had just begun to unfold, right after he could now be completely himself? Detective Sergeant Hank Idsinger was on the case when the authorities dug up the record. They found that Bruce McArthur wasn't really the good old man they thought he was. He might have looked like a gentle Santa Claus with a polite demeanor, but his history showed a different story.
He looked like Santa Claus. Even on his profile, his pic had a picture of him as the mall Santa. He didn't strike me as someone who was going to kill me.
In 2001, Bruce had assaulted Mark Henderson, a model and actor at a bar. In the afternoon on October 31st, 2001, McArthur had followed Mark into his apartment building. He had been invited into Henderson's apartment, so he wasn't really stalking or anything at this point. But he was invited for nothing other than to see Mark's Halloween costume. What he did next shocked Mark. McArthur struck Henderson with an iron pipe. Henderson tried to fight back with the heavy McArthur, but he soon lost consciousness. When he woke up, he immediately dialed 911 and was rushed to St. Michael's Hospital. He had injuries on his head and body. He not only needed several stitches, but several weeks of physiotherapy. That was the extent of the injuries caused to Henderson at the hands of McArthur. That's violent, period. That's in no way an accident or anything else. Bruce hit Henderson with an iron rod, and that landed him in the hospital. What more evidence is needed to put Bruce behind bars, right? But that's not what happened. Here's what happened. McArthur turned himself in right after the attack and said that he did not remember the incident at all or why he might have even done it in the first place. He did this to look innocent and mislead the authorities into thinking he was probably drunk or maybe mentally not doing well. But still, he had injured Mark badly, and this should have not just gone away like that. So then he pleaded guilty to charges of assault with a weapon and assault causing bodily harm, due to which on April 11th, 2003, Bruce got a conditional 2-year sentence. So why not jail? Here's the twist. Bruce's ploy of acting out of his mind worked. Even though the Crown Attorney had earlier believed that jail time was warranted, they later agreed to a conditional sentence after a psychiatric and pre-sentencing report that suggested that McArthur was a low-risk offender. Yes, I repeat, he was deemed a low-risk offender after that horrific assault on Mark Henderson. There was proof, there was an injured and hospitalized Henderson, but then poor Bruce Bruce had a psychiatric problem, is what the authorities believed. But a low-risk offender, really? Mark was so traumatized by this incident that he even failed to provide any victim impact statement for the sentencing. On top of that, concerns that the authorities thought that McArthur's unexplained behavior was possibly a result of a combination of his anti-seizure medication with muscle relaxants that are usually taken before sex. McArthur spent the first year of his sentence under house arrest, which was followed by a 6-month curfew and then 3 years of probation. During this entire time, Bruce was not allowed to visit the Church and Wellesley area, except if he had some important work or medical appointments. He was ordered to stay at least 10 meters, 33 feet from Mark Henderson's home or workplace and was not allowed to spend any time with any male prostitute. McArthur was further forbidden to possess any firearms for the next 10 years. He was not allowed to purchase, possess, or consume any drugs without a medical prescription. His DNA was submitted to the criminal database for record, and he had to undergo psychological and psychiatric counseling, which also included anger management. By now, it's more clear that Bruce was a violent attacker. This whole incident was by no means a small one. You can see that from the degree of injury and from the kind of sentence Bruce received. It seems like Bruce was a person who enjoyed exercising power. He wanted control, and he loved dominating, which soon became a discovery when more evidence and a clear picture were put together. What was considered a one-off incident by the authorities would turn out to be an unfortunate tragedy for many, many lives in the coming years. They had no idea about how horribly wrong they were. Here's what the judge had to say to Bruce back then during the Henderson assault case. "It sounds to me like you're a pretty good person, and it sounds to me that you're not going to be back here anyway." 16 years later in 2017, when all the clues finally started pointing toward him, it became clear that the particular incident with the male prostitute was indeed a huge red flag. Bruce McArthur was violent, he was a control freak, and he was a murderer. And the 2001 incident wasn't the only one. Strangely enough, the police had missed another major clue. In 2016, Bruce had slipped under the radar yet again, and this time he had choked a man in the back of his van. He had known a man by the name of Peter Scromo for a long time. Peter described the incident saying that everything was going fine, but then suddenly Bruce started choking him really hard, as though he was about to kill him.
He really grabbed my neck, violently twisted it right to his crotch, and his pants were undone. And that's when I really was quite disturbed. One more second, he would have snapped and broken my neck, and I was a dead man.
Luckily, Scromo managed to escape the scene without any injuries and is very much alive today, unlike the other men who, unfortunately, didn't get as lucky. This was a dead giveaway that Bruce was a violent man who had sexual fantasies surrounding control and domination. While such fantasies do exist in a lot of people, not everyone goes around murdering people in cold blood like Bruce did. However, when Bruce McArthur had already raised red flags in 2001 with the assault of the male prostitute, it should have been clear what he was capable of. After he choked the man in the back of his van, the police had interviewed him. He blatantly denied the allegations. What really stands out is that the authorities believed his word. Funnily enough, the investigation was closed. No more questions asked. Bruce's word was the word. This shows that his arrest, or further investigation, or surveillance that should have followed these incidents was simply missed. There was no keen eye that could catch this. Rather, with such strong allegations against Bruce, the police didn't even need to have a keen eye. It was right there out in the open, what he was capable of. Sadly, it was a shocking lapse on the part of the authorities. Only after Andrew Kingsman's disappearance did all of the missing persons cases from up to 7 years ago take back some momentum and were reopened. Bruce McArthur was now a potential suspect in all the cases of the missing men. Now, we all know that Project Houston didn't really amount to anything back then, so now the police launched another project called Project Prism. This time they had clues. They also knew that they could now search his van for more solid evidence to corner him and finally close all the cases. Bruce McArthur was a step ahead of the game. He had already gotten rid of his red Dodge Caravan. Now, the task at hand for the authorities was to find that red Dodge Dodge Caravan at any cost. They began contacting all the second-hand car dealers and junkyards in order to find Bruce's old car, where they could find clues like DNA or any items that belonged to any of the missing men. Project Prism was their last hope. September was the month that would prove lucky for them, as they were finally able to locate Bruce's red Dodge Caravan. They found it 66 kilometers outside Toronto at an auto parts dealer. They were about to make some serious discoveries, and Bruce's days as a free man were about to be over. After the forensics tested various materials in the van, they found Andrew Kingsman's blood in the back of Bruce's van. They had found their serial killer, the seemingly polite man who was a monster within. They have rock-solid evidence against McArthur for Andrew Kingsman's murder. What they don't have is all the other evidence linking him to the disappearances of the other 5 men in the case. The authorities decided to put up maximum surveillance to catch a glimpse of McArthur's every move. They wanted to catch him red-handed. They wanted a confession. The now 66-year-old Bruce McArthur lived with someone in a high-rise apartment. The authorities already had an arrest warrant from the judge, based on compelling evidence of Andrew Kingsman's blood in his van. All they needed was some more evidence from his laptop, and for that, they'd have to sneak into his house and clone his laptop for analysis. December 7th, 2017. Bruce McArthur's fate was about to be sealed. He was about to get a shocker that he didn't see coming. The authorities snuck into his apartment and cloned his computer. They made unbelievably shocking discoveries in his computer files. He was darker than they thought him to be. Much darker, more violent, and most definitely cold-blooded murderer. Bruce McArthur, the man who had been Santa Claus in a mall, was the exact opposite of one in real life. He gave no present. In fact, he took innocent men's present and future away from them. He had created separate files for all of those missing men on his computer. His absolute monstrosity was on display for the authorities to see. He would kill his victim and then take their pictures after he killed them. He also had pictures of all of them from the time they were alive. And it wasn't just the 6 men we've been talking about. There were also 2 other unknown men's files on his computer. There were no missing reports of these 2 men, so it was a new discovery for the police. One of the victims was 37-year-old Krishna Kumar Kanagaratanam, who was also a Sri Lankan refugee, just like Bruce's other victim, Skanda Navaratnam. The other victim was Dean Lezowick, who was a resident of the shelter system in Toronto. Bruce McArthur was more disgusting than you think. He didn't just kill these men.
Multiple men were photographed naked, wearing only this fur hat and fur coat. Some had an unlit cigar placed in their mouth,
but also kept their hair as souvenirs so that he could use them to revisit the memories of his killings.
McArthur would also shave the beards and heads of his victims after he murdered them. Police found the hair of McArthur's victims in these Ziploc bags.
What a nightmare of a man. It's very clear to see Bruce's pattern of choosing his victims. The cruel murderer picked out some of the most vulnerable people in society so that he could exercise control over them. As you can see, most of his victims were refugees and immigrants from developing countries. Since most of his victims didn't have their families with them in Canada, the chances of them being reported missing were less as compared to Canadian citizens. Bruce McArthur didn't want these victims to get noticed when they went missing. But here's the question that always stands in any crime. What was his motive? Why did he choose this violent path and kill so many people, especially when his life was actually looking up after his divorce? When the authorities tried to figure out Bruce's motive, Bruce's digital footprint revealed that he was into sadomasochism. What is sadomasochism? According to Psychology Today, sadomasochism can be defined as the taking of pleasure, often sexual in nature, from the inflicting or suffering of pain, hardship, or humiliation. It can feature as an enhancement to sexual intercourse, or less commonly, as a substitute. The infliction of pain leads to sexual pleasure, while the simulation of violence can serve to express and consolidate attachment. This explains why he often derived pleasure from inflicting pain. Sadomasochism is a fantasy and a part of bondage sexual activities. It does have its own boundaries and rules. Quite evidently, Bruce McArthur took it too far. He killed people. He clearly went beyond the safe boundaries of the fantasy, which isn't normal at all. And not to mention consent-based boundaries. And that probably stems from not just a mere sexual fantasy, but a much deeper psychological issue relating to exercising control over others. Bruce McArthur wasn't just enjoying his sexual fantasies, but was a violent murderer. He was exercising his violent tendencies by using his sexual fantasies as a catalyst. He was brutal, and this was premeditated murder. He sought out his victim, lured them, he trapped them, and then he killed them. With no loopholes or doubts in the overwhelming evidence against Bruce McArthur, the police were now going to act. It was high time, and Bruce needed to be in prison. In early 2018, while the cops still had Bruce under constant surveillance, Bruce was with a man. The authorities had decided that the moment Bruce went behind closed doors with another man, that was it. That's the time they would break in and arrest him. Even if that didn't happen, they had planned to arrest him later that week in January, nevertheless. However, Bruce, being the monster that he was, succumbed to his violent mind and was planning to raise the victim count by one more. Bruce's violent plans were about to come to a screeching halt. As soon as Bruce took the man back with him to his house, the authorities went after him and arrested him. The man with Bruce was saved from being his 9th victim. According to a source, the police officers found the young man restrained on a bed when they entered Bruce McArthur's apartment,
who police found tied to McArthur's bed, still alive, the day police arrested Bruce McArthur.
The man wasn't injured, but visibly quite shaken. His name was not revealed, and in court, he was referred to as John. This man, like most of Bruce's other victims, had arrived in Canada from the Middle East just 5 years earlier. He too was married and had not come out to his family as gay. He had met Bruce through a dating app named Growler and revealed that the two had met for sex several times previously. He also said that it was consensual, and he had agreed to keep his relationship with McArthur a secret. He had allowed Bruce to handcuff him to the bed. Here's a very disturbing detail that makes us believe that this man was going to be Bruce's next murder victim. McArthur had gone a step further than just handcuffing the man. He had put a black bag over his head and had also taped his mouth shut before the police officers rang the doorbell and interrupted him. Had the police arrived later, it might have been a crime scene rather than an arrest scene. Now that Bruce was captured, it was time for the families to find closure. For closure for all of the victims' families, the bodies had to be found. The authorities searched all of the properties where Bruce had lived or worked, and they were able to retrieve all of the bodies in one place.
And it really is, it's very surreal.
Mallory Crescent, Toronto. Bruce used to store his landscaping equipment here. During the winter months, Toronto has sub-zero temperatures, and digging through everything to find the bodies was nothing short of a tedious task for the authorities. It was with the help of canine units that the police were able to discover where the bodies were hidden. One by one, the police recovered decomposing body parts of all 8 victims from inside planters. It was gruesome and heartbreaking. Bruce had dismembered all of his victims. He was a merciless murderer without any conscience. Think about it. He had buried the body parts in the same place where he used to work regularly. What kind of sick mind would do that? The missing men were finally identified with the help of dental records, pictures, fingerprints, and DNA matches. When the authorities searched Bruce's house, they also found a bag containing duct tape and syringes, which somewhat hinted at how he might have killed his victims. He never revealed how he killed them. It's not only the manner in which he has killed the victims, but also the manner in which he treated their bodies after murdering them that shows how his mind worked. He liked control. He liked to revisit that feeling of power over others. And he had complete disregard for anyone's life. In fact, he gained some obnoxious kind of pleasure from all of that he did. Over a period of 5 weeks, the authorities were able to recover the bodies of all victims. And each time a new body was found, a new murder charge was slapped against McArthur. By July 2018, the authorities finally had everything they needed for Bruce's trial. They had a rock-solid case, and with all the overwhelming evidence, Bruce McArthur was most likely never going to be able to torture anyone else again. The trial began in January 2019. Justice John McMahon was ready to serve Bruce McArthur the same hell he had delivered to those 8 vulnerable and innocent men. The words he used for Bruce McArthur were apt: morally bankrupt, a sexual predator and killer who lured his victims on the pretext of consensual sex and killing them for his own warped and sick gratification. That description was apt. Bruce McArthur didn't just kill those men. He degraded them and humiliated them, even in death, by positioning their bodies in a certain way and photographing them post-mortem. It was a sickening display of his twisted mind and cruel intentions. The judge also went on to say, the ability to decapitate and dismember his victims and do it repeatedly is pure evil. 8 counts of first-degree murder, 8 concurrent life sentences. That's insanity. Bruce McArthur pleaded guilty to all 8 counts. The word guilty from the ruthless killer's mouth echoed 8 times in the courtroom as he pleaded guilty for all the 8 times he let humanity down. He obviously had no choice because there was an insane amount of evidence against him in all the 8 missing men's cases now. In February 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole in 25 years. He will be 91 by then, so there's a slim chance of him ever walking to freedom again. Captured by CBC News, here's what was happening live right outside the courtroom while Bruce McArthur's hearing was going on inside. Haran Vijayanatham, Executive Director of the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Prevention, said that it's really tough sitting there and listening to families when they don't know what's going on or fully understand what's happening and the fact that their loved one is gone in such a horrific way. That was the tough part of sitting in the funerals and listening to their cries. That was quite challenging. But today, I supported one of the families to come here. There's a sense of relief, but there's also the confusion of why and how and when it all happened. Even though Bruce McArthur received a life sentence, some family members felt unhappy that he was eligible for parole after just 25 years. Yes, he will be old by then, but according to them, the gravity of his crimes should have gotten him either a no parole situation or at least 50 years before he can apply for parole. The members of the gay community were also unhappy with that sentence. In response, the police said that they were happy with the sentence for a few reasons. Firstly, it is still a life sentence regardless of parole eligibility. And even if McArthur lives to be 91, the parole board won't let him out in the public. He will be denied parole and he won't ever walk free in public again. Well, we can say for sure that the heinous crimes he committed on innocent men that never ever deserved it. Bruce is lucky that the death penalty isn't a thing in Canada anymore. There would be a high chance that he'd receive it for a whopping 8 first-degree murders, the tragic loss of innocent lives, and the unbelievable trauma he caused, not just to the gay community in Toronto, but the entire city and country. Who could have thought that a man that seemed so gentle could turn out to be such a brutal monster? Never judge a book by its cover. Never judge a book by its cover just fits this tragedy all too well. That he could cover his tracks for almost a whole decade and murder 8 men during a time period without getting caught is shocking. It was his demeanor and the way he was on the outside that never gave away his devious intentions on the inside. A mask he wore to come across as Mr. Nice Guy. It came as a shock to even the authorities because they never imagined, even after talking to him, that he could harm a fly, let alone be a serial killer.
No, just like that.
Okay. Things have never gotten violent.
No.
Okay.
As we said earlier, serial killings usually start in early adulthood, mostly in a person's 20s, as we see in the majority of cases. This is why the police haven't stopped investigating this particular case. They're still piecing together other unsolved missing persons cases that go back as far as the 70s to check if Bruce McArthur had anything to do with those. Allegedly, back in the 70s, a similar pattern of men going missing in Canada was happening and there was no closure. Without any evidence or bodies, the cases had gone cold. After Bruce's sentencing, those cases are open again, and the authorities are checking if the seemingly gentle but rather violent Bruce was behind any of them. According to a police source, McArthur had been able to cover his tracks all of these years because he had used different aliases online. Instead of mobile phones, he used payphones and avoided areas with CCTV cameras. Detective Sergeant Stacy Gallant of the TPS Homicide Squad Cold Case Unit said that a whopping 600 cold cases were being looked at for further attention, and the involvement of Bruce McArthur in any of those. The authorities drew up a list of 15 homicide cold cases linked to the gay village that fit the general profile of the victims in the Bruce McArthur case. Investigators started reviewing cases of missing gay men between 1975 and 1997 for a possible connection to McArthur. The victims of those crimes, which took place mainly in the 70s, were all gay men who were found to be in their homes, naked, and tied to their bed. These poor men were either brutally stabbed or beaten to death in a manner described as overkill. Considering Bruce McArthur's case, it doesn't seem unlikely that he could be a suspect in any of these cases soon if any evidence is found linking him to those cases. In order to strengthen their efforts, investigators had also planned to return to the 30 properties associated with McArthur during spring and summer when the frozen ground had thawed. This would allow the cadaver dogs to operate with more accuracy. The excavations also included a return visit to the Lee Side residence, where other remains were found. Eventually, a total of 100 properties. Even those outside of the city were investigated and additional searches were concluded. While they did find the remains of all 8 victims, they didn't find any evidence of additional bodies or victims. Sergeant Id Singer said that they had no evidence so far that suggested McArthur was connected to any other deaths apart from these 8 men. Having said that, the investigations into cold cases continued. Hopefully there will be more evidence, and if Bruce McArthur is guilty of killing any other people, he should bear additional punishment. All said and done, the authorities and families still don't have complete closure. By that, we mean that Bruce still hadn't revealed the why behind these killings. Sure, he liked control and was a vile person who found gratification in inflicting pain on others, but why these particular people? Was there another motive? Police have been talking to Bruce to try to figure that out, but there's nothing so far. After Bruce's arrest, people weren't going to let it rest. Looking at the entire case and the investigation, the fact that in the past it never led to Bruce, when it should have, raised many questions about how the police handled the cases of the missing men. Many people allege that the missing men's cases weren't really paid much attention to because of 2 things. These men were gay, and they were mostly brown men from poor countries. This double layer of being a minority in Canada led the police to being careless in these cases. It was only when Andrew Kingsman went missing that everything really started moving quickly. It's chilling to think that if Andrew Kingsman hadn't gone missing, Bruce probably would have never been caught. Think about it. It took the police 17 years to understand all these missing men's cases. And despite there being red flags, with Bruce having previous assault cases, the police failed to interrogate him for the missing men's cases. On the other hand, the police say that it was unfortunate because since these men had no families in Canada, they were not reported missing in time. While in Andrew Kingsman's case, he was reported missing within the first 72 hours after he went missing, which led them to uncover the evidence quickly and move forward with the case. One thing is for sure, looks can be deceptive, and that's what's so frightening in the world of crime. You never know who is wearing that mask, which is why it's important to always be vigilant and to have a good support system to help you with safety measures if you ever need them. Thanks for tuning in to Twisted Minds. That was the case of Bruce McArthur, and why don't you go ahead and click on one of the 2 videos on your screen for another one of our videos.